In the Academy Award-winning film Patton, the iconic scene in which George C. Scott delivers General George S. Patton Jr.'s infamous exhortation about making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country was dramatically misplaced, for the real Patton's address occurred on October 28, 1944, in France, before the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, famously known as Patton's Panthers, the first all-black armored unit in U.S. Army history to see combat. After a grueling dash across France, the battalion had paused for repairs and final checkups when Patton, flanked by his entourage and wearing his signature ivory-handled pistols, leapt onto the hood of an armored car and shouted words that would echo through history. "Men, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill the kraut. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down. They say it is patriotic to die for your country. Well, let's see how many patriots we can make out of those German SOBs." Yet this moment of valor emerged against a backdrop of entrenched racial prejudice within the U.S. military, which prior to 1940, largely assumed that black soldiers were inferior combat troops and relegated them to support roles such as cooks, drivers, and stewards. Only 5 black commissioned officers existed in 1941, 3 of whom were chaplains, and influential figures like Colonel James A. Moss of the 92nd Division openly declared that African American soldiers were second-class material due to their purportedly inferior intelligence and moral qualities, while Colonel Percy L. Miles insisted their primary role in future wars should be confined to labor organizations. Even Patton himself admitted in a letter to his wife that a colored soldier cannot think fast enough to fight in armor, yet federal legislation, specifically the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, mandated non-discrimination in recruitment, though the White House simultaneously allowed segregation to persist. As the war approached, all black units commanded by white officers, including the 5th Tank Group and its battalions, the 761st, 758th, and 784th, were hastily assembled, often under the assumption that these troops would never see battle. The 761st, activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, on April 1, 1942, came under the leadership of Major Paul Bates in May 1943, whose dedication and visible presence in grueling training exercises through swamps, mud, and oppressive Louisiana heat fostered morale and esprit de corps. Black soldiers began to carry themselves with a new confidence, their heads held high and caps tilted at a jaunty angle, though many privately doubted that all their training would ever lead to combat. Meanwhile, the realities of segregation were ever present. The men endured isolation, long walks to facilities, and strict bus rules enforced by armed drivers, highlighting the harsh racial discrimination that existed even as these tankers prepared to demonstrate their skill, courage, and resilience on the battlefields of Europe, where they would ultimately prove their mettle and challenge the very prejudices that had sought to limit them. The 761st Tank Battalion, soon to be famous as the Black Panthers and stamped with a defiant motto, "Come out fighting," spent more than 2 years grinding through training at Camp Claiborne and Camp Hood, Texas, before the long-anticipated orders for overseas movement finally came on June 9, 1944, mere days after the D-Day landings. 3 months later, the 800-man unit boarded the British troop transport Esperance Bay in New York and came ashore in Britain on September 8, only to be shuffled from the 9th Army to General Patton's 3rd Army on October 2, a reassignment wrapped in rumor and myth that even today colors the battalion's origin story. Patton, some said, had personally asked for the unit, their Black Panther shoulder patch and fighting motto earning them the nickname Patton's Panthers. And when the War Department replied there were only Negro tankers left to send, Patton reportedly snapped. "Who they asked for color? I asked for tankers." Fully armed for the grueling mobile warfare ahead, the battalion was outfitted with 54 M4 Sherman medium tanks distributed among 3 companies and Mosquito fleet of 15 smaller M5 Stuarts, machines that embodied Allied doctrine, speed, reliability, and rate of fire from a 75mm gun and coaxial .30 caliber machine guns, plus a heavy .50 mounted atop the turret, yet which were tactically disadvantaged against the German Panthers and Tigers with their thicker armor, longer range guns, wider tracks, and diesel engines that made them less prone to catastrophic fires, hence the Sherman's grim nicknames. The British called it the Ronson, the Germans the Tommy Cooker. After landing in Normandy on October 20, 1944, Patton's new Black Panthers hurled themselves across France, some 400 miles in 6 breathless days, to link up with Patton at Nancy and Nicolas Deport, and then to support Major General Willard S. Paul's 26th Infantry Division as the Allies tightened their ring around Germany. It was in the electric, tense week before the assault on the fortress city of Metz that Patton climbed onto an armored car and thundered his infamous pep talk, a blunt exhortation to the men to show no mercy, words that, as he stepped down, he punctuated by ordering a young Corporal E.G. McConnell to shoot every damn thing you see: church steeples, water towers, houses, old ladies, children, haystacks, because this is war, a ferocity that had some of the tankers exchanging nervous smiles and whispered reactions. Corporal Howard Richardson turned to his captain and muttered that the old man was crazy as hell, more frightening in his fierce intensity than the Krauts themselves. Yet those same men, forged by long months of training in mud and heat and hardened by segregation back in the camps, carried Patton's blunt charge with quiet resolve into the battles ahead, determined to prove both their prowess as armored troops and the lie of the prejudices that had tried to confine them to the sidelines. The 761st Tank Battalion, freshly arrived on the European front, met its baptism of fire during the rumored big offensive that began at dawn on November 8, 1944, a brutal operation unfolding in the same sector where American troops had fought in 1918, stretching south of Chateau Salins through the tangled Moncourt woods to a hill northwest of the town, facing the formidable German 11th and 13th Panzer divisions. The battlefield itself was a treacherous mix of terrain and circumstance. Repeated Allied bombing had cracked the Deuse Dam, flooding the valley of the Seal River and low-lying areas, creating a landscape almost engineered to punish advancing forces. As the battle ignited, the screaming shells of German 88mm artillery cut across the valley, walking massive columns of smoke and dust over the lowlands, a terrifying backdrop against which the Americans, infantry and tanks alike, struggled to advance under the punishing enemy fire. Amid this chaos, the voice of Captain David Williams broke over the company's radio, a cheerful, almost absurdly light-hearted tone delivered in Harlemese despite his being white, urging his men forward with words of encouragement. "Now looky here, you cats. We gotta hit it down the main drag and hep some of them unheaped cats on the other side. So let's roll on down to 7th Avenue and knock 'em, Jack." Yet the first casualties came not from the armored line but from the rear, highlighting that danger in war was never confined to the front. Private Clifford Adams, serving as an aid man with a medical detachment, was killed almost immediately while rendering aid to a wounded soldier, the shell that struck him a cruel, unpredictable reminder that fate in battle is often blind. The calamity did not stop there. While the thunder of artillery and tank fire reverberated along the front, a small German patrol penetrated the woodland thickets to where Colonel Paul Bates, the trusted and inspiring commander of the battalion, stood atop his jeep observing the fight. Bullets struck the vehicle, and Bates was seriously wounded, collapsing under enemy fire on the very first day of combat, leaving the men he had trained and instilled with pride suddenly bereft of leadership. The void was temporarily filled by Executive Officer Major Charles Wingo, transported forward in Smitty's tank, only to succumb to terror and panic in the midst of battle. Shaken and overwhelmed, Wingo abandoned his men, retreating in a jeep to the rear, evacuated later for combat fatigue, and effectively disappearing from the unit. With the colonel wounded and the executive officer gone, the 761st faced the nightmare of combat without its senior leadership, a situation that required immediate intervention. Into the breach stepped Lieutenant Colonel Hollis E. Hunt, transferred from another battalion to assume command, tasked with steadying the shaken Black Panthers as they confronted the brutal realities of modern warfare, terrain, enemy fire, and the stark, unforgiving truth that courage and cohesion would be tested not only by the Germans ahead but by the collapse and fear behind them. Despite prevailing prejudices that questioned the combat effectiveness of black soldiers, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, demonstrated extraordinary courage almost immediately, proving skeptics wrong in the most brutal of circumstances. As the unit approached Morville, Charlie Company's tanks became trapped behind a cunningly concealed anti-tank ditch, 15 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and lined with steel spikes at the bottom. Snow fell heavily, mixing with the relentless hail of mortar and artillery fire that rained down on the exposed American troops. Buried mines erupted in chaotic succession, tearing through both infantry and armored vehicles, while tracer rounds stitched jagged patterns across the white landscape. Several tanks were hit in the initial enemy barrage, some erupting in flames, forcing tankers to abandon their vehicles and scramble to aid wounded comrades, some plunging into the freezing, muddy waters of the ditch where men struggled to survive amidst a growing heap of injured soldiers and immobilized tanks. Amid this chaos, First Sergeant Sam Turley distinguished himself as a heroic figure. When his own tank was hit, he recognized that the soldiers trapped in the ditch faced near certain death unless they could climb to higher ground. Turley dashed up and down the ditch, shouting urgent instructions to guide men toward cover, and then with unflinching resolve, positioned himself behind the ditch to provide covering fire. Snow whipped around him as he stood tall, ammunition belts draped over his shoulders, gripping a spitting .50 caliber machine gun. Turley continued to fire until German counterfire struck him, ultimately killing him with a direct hit from an 88mm shell, his finger frozen to the trigger as the gun continued to blaze, a stark symbol of valor and sacrifice. Yet the battle pressed on, and the Black Panthers, suffering heavy casualties, drove relentlessly toward Metz, battling rain, mud, snow, sleet, and an unyielding enemy. Sergeant Reuben Rivers, an Oklahoma farm boy turned tank commander, became another emblem of courage. Under intense fire, he exited his tank to attach a cable to Dragon's Teeth obstacles, clearing the path for his platoon, only to suffer a grievous leg wound when a mine detonated beneath his tank. Rejecting evacuation, Rivers told Captain David Williams, "We got a job to do," and led his remaining tanks through the village of Gebling, disregarding warnings that the town was too dangerous. Over the next 3 days, Rivers destroyed enemy armor and inflicted heavy casualties, engaging Mark IV Panzers and tank destroyers in a desperate delaying action that allowed American forces caught in the open to withdraw. Despite multiple tank losses and his wounds worsening toward gangrene, Rivers refused to leave the fight, asserting that another day would make no difference, until finally, his Sherman was struck by successive enemy shells, and the indomitable sergeant, who had refused to yield in the face of almost certain death, was killed in action, leaving behind a legacy of relentless bravery that would forever define the Black Panthers' heroism in World War II. As the 761st Tank Battalion pressed forward into the heart of the European theater, the ferocity of the enemy's resistance intensified, with 3rd Army units spearheading assaults on the French-built Maginot Line and preparing for the eventual push into Germany's formidable Siegfried Line. For the Black Panthers, the relentless grind of combat became an immersive, unforgiving school in which they learned to live with danger in every form: artillery, mines, sniper fire, and the ever-present threat of death, and discovered that the horrors of war transcended any societal constructs of skin color, religion, or social class. On the battlefield, white and black soldiers fought side by side, sharing discomfort, fear, and the unrelenting pressures of survival. Only in the relative safety of the rear areas did old prejudices briefly reappear. Corporal E.G. McConnell, wounded at Honskirch and evacuated to a field hospital, found himself the lone black soldier among the injured and suffered the sting of an insensitive remark from a visiting major general. "What's wrong with you, boy?" Got the claps. A cruel echo of a long-standing stereotype that cut McConnell to the core and reinforced his determination to return to the front and prove his valor. That determination defined the Panthers as they smashed through the German garrison Maginot Line on December 9, 1944, rolling into German soil with a mixture of awe and defiance, Sergeant Willie McCall spitting contemptuously at the fortified position and dismissing it as the supposed home of Superman. Yet their valor would soon be tested anew. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest erupted in the muzzle flashes of hundreds of German artillery pieces, signaling the opening salvo of Hitler's desperate Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Ordered by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower to pivot north and relieve the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne, Patton's Third Army, including the 761st, now under Major John F. George, raced to the front to support the 87th Infantry Division in recapturing the village of Tillet, a strategic point a mere 3 miles from the Marche-Bastogne Highway, a vital German supply route. Over 6 days of grueling combat, the Black Panthers and accompanying infantry slogged through broken roads and dense pine forests, confronting stiff, methodical resistance from the elite Begleit Brigade of the 13th Panzer Division. German defenses were cunningly constructed, incorporating machine gun nests, mortars, self-propelled guns, and armored units, all designed to blunt the American advance. Despite the Panthers' superior training, skill, and determination, the battle for Tillet became a brutal seesaw, with Allied forces repeatedly repelled by a tenacious and well-prepared enemy, forcing the men of the 761st to adapt constantly, improvise under fire, and steel themselves for the unrelenting challenges of pushing into the heart of the Third Reich. On the bitterly cold night of January 4, 1945, the men of Able Company of the 761st Tank Battalion faced a moment of extraordinary tension and uncertainty. Captain David Williams, their company commander, feared that German forces might have deduced the Americans' limited supplies and could launch a crushing counterattack before the expected airborne reinforcements arrived. Unsure if his men could withstand an all-out assault, Williams called a meeting of platoon leaders and non-commissioned officers in a small snowbound house in the village of Jerrymont. Exhausted, filthy, and unshaven like the soldiers around him, he did not mince words. "If the Germans attack us, we can't hold them. I guarantee you that if we resist, they'll kill us all. I'm the company commander, but I'm going to bow out of this one. This is one decision you guys have got to make. Do you want me to wave my underwear, or do you want to fight it out?" A tense silence followed, broken only when Sergeant Walter Lewis slammed his coffee cup on the table and stood, declaring firmly, "We can't give up, Captain. It wouldn't be right. I say we fight it out." Nervous laughter rippled through the room, and the vote was unanimous. Williams, relieved, echoed their resolve. "If Walter wants to fight it out, then we'll fight it out." By morning, the airborne reinforcements had arrived, their vehicles crunching over frozen snow, and the feared German counterattack never materialized. At dawn, the Black Panthers launched their assault on Tillet, creeping through fog and snow as Axis Sally, broadcasting propaganda over jammed American radio frequencies, tried to sow doubt and fear. "Good morning, Negro soldiers of the 761st, she crooned, imploring them to abandon their posts and return home, emphasizing that their fight was not against Germany but a white man's war, orchestrated by white officers like Captain Williams and Major George. Yet the men pressed on, undeterred, guided by discipline, courage, and a fierce sense of duty. Amid the chaos and savage combat, where victory and defeat were never clear, Tank Commander Frank Cochran shouted defiantly, "They've hit me 3 times. But I'm still giving 'em hell." Crusty Captain Charles Popgates personally led a decisive 10-tank assault on a fortified German hilltop, clearing the final obstacle to Tillet, which finally fell on January 7, 1945. German prisoners, astonished to see black soldiers in uniform, asked incredulously, "What are you doing here? This is a white man's war." Sergeant Johnny Holmes, offering one a cigarette, responded calmly, "You ain't got no black or white when you're over here and the nation is in trouble. You only got Americans." Amidst the battle's aftermath, Colonel Paul Bates, who had been grievously wounded on the battalion's first day of combat, fulfilled his promise and returned to command on January 17. By then, the 761st had been profoundly reshaped. Many of the veterans from Camp Claiborne and Camp Hood had been killed or wounded, and over 30% of the unit had been replaced. Yet the Black Panthers, hardened by relentless combat and tested by fire, emerged stronger, more cohesive, and resolutely committed to proving themselves on the European battlefield. After the grueling Battle of the Bulge, the 761st Tank Battalion, battered but unbroken, received orders to proceed to Saverne, France, and temporarily attached to the 7th Army to tackle one of Germany's last formidable defenses, the Siegfried Line. The campaign, beginning on March 20, 1945, proved to be an unrelenting slugfest. German forces had entrenched themselves with pillboxes, camouflaged artillery, and machine gun nests hidden in woods and fields flanking the narrow roads leading to strategically vital towns. The men of the 761st advanced relentlessly, Sherman tanks charging head-on into the enemy, while infantry dismounted to scale the high ground and flush out entrenched soldiers, turning every hill, ridge, and forested patch into a battlefield of constant peril. The town of Sils, sitting at a critical crossroads at the base of a gentle decline, became a key objective. Charlie and Baker companies, led by Captains Charles Popgates and Johnny Long, supported the infantry assault. An American artillery strike ignited a German ammunition dump, sending flames skyward and setting the town ablaze, casting flickering orange light over the advancing tanks. The attack's speed and surprise overwhelmed the German anti-tank positions, capturing them without resistance. As American forces surged through one side of Sils, a fleeing German column, comprising trucks, horse-drawn artillery, and anti-tank guns, attempted to escape. The 761 Estes tanks caught them at a series of twisting S-curves, annihilating the column with devastating precision. Debris, burning vehicles, shattered artillery, and fallen soldiers littered the roadway, forcing Colonel Bates to deploy tank dozers to clear the path for continued advancement. Following this breakthrough, the 761st joined Task Force Rhine to cross the Great River itself, Germany's last natural frontier. In the course of this operation, the Black Panthers destroyed 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, 29 anti-tank guns, and 11 ammunition trucks, while capturing 7 towns and 20 enemy anti-tank positions. Their efforts killed 833 German soldiers and resulted in the capture of 3,210 prisoners, with a loss of just 5 American tanks and the expenditure of 300 tons of ammunition. By March 30th, the battalion reached Langenselbold, Germany, with the end of the war looming. Patton's Panthers pressed forward, traversing the Reichland, cruising the Autobahn, and overrunning airfields while engaging enemy troops hidden along the roads. Refugees and gaunt, gray-clad prisoners became a common sight as the Americans surged across the collapsing Third Reich. Charlie Company captured Wallenstein Castle in Neuhaus, a stronghold previously held by Hitler's Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, and known for housing looted treasures from occupied countries, a symbolic triumph reinforcing the sense that the conflict was nearing its conclusion. Yet the advancing troops were soon confronted with an even more sobering reality: Nazi concentration camps. As the battalion approached one such labor camp, surrounded by barbed wire, stunned tankers climbed from their vehicles and bore witness to horrors previously unimaginable, an indelible mark on the men who had survived so many battles. In the final weeks of the war, historical tides surged decisively. On April 28, Radio Milan announced the execution of Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and 2 days later, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in Berlin. On May 5, 1945, the 761st reached Steyr, Austria, on the banks of the Enns River, where over 100,000 German soldiers, retreating from the Soviet advance, surrendered en masse. The Black Panthers, battle-hardened from months of unrelenting combat, herded the prisoners into a sprawling field that had become an improvised holding area, witnessing the final collapse of a regime they had fought so hard to defeat, marking the culmination of a campaign that had tested their courage, skill, and resolve at every turn. By the time World War II in Europe came to a close, the 761st Tank Battalion, famously known as the Black Panthers, had endured 183 grueling continuous days of combat, distinguishing themselves as one of the most formidable armored units in the Allied armies. In that time, they had fought in 4 major campaigns across 6 countries, seamlessly integrating with 3 different American armies and 7 separate divisions, proving their versatility, courage, and tactical prowess. The battalion's impact on the Axis forces was staggering. More than 130,000 enemy casualties were inflicted under their relentless advance. Individual heroism was abundant, as 8 black enlisted men received battlefield commissions and 391 men were awarded decorations for acts of extraordinary bravery. Among them, Sergeant Reuben Rivers posthumously received the Medal of Honor, while 7 Silver Stars, including 3 awarded posthumously, 56 Bronze Stars, and 246 Purple Hearts recognized the courage and sacrifice of the unit's members. The battalion had suffered its own share of losses. 3 officers and 31 enlisted men were killed in action, while 22 officers and 180 enlisted men were wounded in the line of duty. The unit's valor and extraordinary contribution were formally recognized much later, in 1998, when the 761st Tank Battalion received a long-overdue Presidential Unit Citation, cementing its legacy in American military history. On Victory in Europe Day, the battalion's tanks lined up along a modest bridge spanning the Enns River, their crews standing in disciplined formation. General George S. Patton, Jr., tall and imposing, rose in his jeep, acknowledging the men with a crisp salute. The soldiers of the 761st returned the gesture smartly, a fitting tribute to their skill and perseverance. Patton, ever the soldier and strategist, allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He had asked for the best tankers in the army, and in the Black Panthers, he had indeed found them, a unit whose courage, determination, and unbreakable spirit had helped bring the war in Europe to its victorious end.